The more they shoot, the cheaper the oil gets. Well, absolutely. Contour. Doesn't that sound intuitive to you? Trump says the ceasefire with Iran is over. The U.S. is striking Iranian targets for the second day in a row. Iran is responding by hitting bases in Tuva, Kuwait, and Bahrain. You'd think this would be the perfect recipe for oil prices to soar. But what about oil? It's getting cheaper. It's not getting more expensive. I wasn't mistaken. It's getting cheaper. And this, as they say, is not a market mistake. The market usually doesn't make mistakes. Today we'll figure out why the logic of more shooting means more expensive gasoline didn't work this time. And what this actually tells us about what's really happening in the Persian Gulf. They don't tell us about this. But the price gives it away. Listen, it's actually pretty funny. Today we'll go over sort of three things. Well, one, but so to speak, 3 points of the same topic. First, what actually happened with the ceasefire in the Hormuz Strait over the past week. Second, why the oil market is behaving differently than the average news viewer would expect. And third, what this tells us about Trump's real intentions, which, well, are very different from what the headlines show. Near the end, I'll reveal what's really happening. Almost no one has said out loud how this might be connected to, you guessed it, the November elections in the U.S. But we'll get to that a bit later. Is the ceasefire still ongoing or has it ended? The Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran was signed on June 17th. It provided for a ceasefire, the lifting of the naval blockade on Iran, and the opening of the Hormuz Strait. 3 weeks later at the summit in Ankara, Trump said, "In my opinion, it's all over." The U.S. has carried out, well, at this point, 90 strikes and continues, so I think we'll reach about 150 by the end of the night against Iranian targets. Iran responded with attacks on American facilities and traffic through the Hormuz Strait, the world's most important oil artery, which used to see an average of 110 ships per day drop to 13 ships. Tankers are turning back. By all formal indications, this is a military escalation, which threatens global oil supplies. Right? Well, that's correct. Right? Escalation, oil. And this is where the astonishing part begins. I'll explain the rest in detail in a couple of minutes. The market didn't react to this the way it should have. Why? That's the question. The price paradox. The usual viewer's logic is simple. If they're shooting more, it means there are fewer supplies. So gasoline costs more now, right? That's how intuition works, and in most cases, it's right. But look at the numbers. The price of oil is falling. Trump himself confirmed this directly, writing that prices are falling like a stone. How is that? Where's the logic? Why? There must be some meaning to this. Well, maybe Tadafon won't get shelled, right? And there are actually two working explanations for that. The first one, the market doesn't trade based on today, but on expectations for months ahead. If traders believe this is just another flare-up for a few days, and not a full-scale, say, 6-month blockade, the price doesn't spike sharply because panic isn't factored in from the start. So the market thinks this is all just a simulation of bustling activity, or as we used to say in my childhood, sikasikdi, a simulation of bustling activity. And that both sides are just waving their fists. Well, and maybe something else, maybe with whatever is clenched in that fist. Second, and this is more important, look at where the strikes are aimed. Are they hitting any vital arteries? Oil, water desalination, energy. Well, the biggest thing that's been destroyed is the bridges, ladies and gentlemen. The strikes are actually hitting specific military targets, not tankers en masse, and not the oil infrastructure as such. If they sank ships in batches, it would be disastrous for supplies. If they strike military targets while technically leaving the possibility for tankers to pass open, the market sees this as what's called a managed conflict, not as a real threat to supply. In other words, it's a game. So all the market is telling us is that they're playing. They've obviously each got their own game going, but they're playing, they're not fighting, they're playing. From this, we can draw an interesting conclusion. In Iran, it's not two hands each doing what they want, but rather a good cop, bad cop situation, but both obey some single voice. You call it the main overseer of Iran or a committee or whatever you want, it doesn't matter, right? What matters is that this is coordinated, and not just the initiative of different groups within the government and various groups pulling in different directions. So maybe they are pulling in different directions together, but still, it's coordinated. I'm not claiming this, I'm just saying that it really seems like the market thinks so, because if the market thought otherwise, prices would be skyrocketing. The result is actually paradoxical. The louder and more aggressive the rhetoric sounds, let's say from Trump, the truce is over, we're going to blow everyone up, there won't be a single untouched spot left on Iran, we're going to capture Kark right now, we're going to restore the naval blockade right now, but without actually blocking traffic through the strait, the market remains calm. The American ships are leaving after all. And those I told you about, the ones heading toward the Persian Gulf, which I thought were being reinforced just for show, actually came to replace others. More are leaving than arriving. Not in addition, yes, but as replacements. And here is that very paradox. Shout as much as you want, wave your hands as much as you want, threaten and predict as much as you want, because the market looks at actions. Shouting turns out to be tighter for gas prices than a quiet but real blockade of the Hormuz Strait would be. And now, the reason why I actually decided to make this video. Why would Trump benefit from exactly this kind of controlled, loud, but not market-choking escalation? Here, it's worth mentioning something that almost no one talks about in our circles. What's happening now in the Persian Gulf is directly related to the calendar of the U.S. midterm elections in November. I'll break this down separately in more detail in one of the upcoming videos. With specific numbers, I'll go into more detail about gas prices at gas stations state by state, and how this might affect voter sentiment in Republican districts. Subscribe so you don't miss it. This will be one of the most underrated stories of this fall. That doesn't mean the conflict isn't real. People are dying, the strikes are real, the escalation is real. But it means that what we're seeing is not a chaotic war, but a managed escalation. It's tough, yes. Just tough enough to keep Iran under pressure, and targeted enough so as not to, God forbid, disrupt the oil market, on whose stability both the American economy and the position of Trump and the Republicans in the country depend. Loud words here work as a tool for negotiations or shouting over each other, not as a description of the actual U.S. position. This is just a version, not a confirmed fact. Of course, I don't have any direct statements from the White House, but the numbers, the traffic through the strait, the price of oil, the nature of the strikes, all of this adds up to this picture, not to the picture they're telling us about over there. Especially my colleagues, the Russian-speaking ones. They're saying it's just Armageddon happening in Iran right now. No, ladies and gentlemen, Armageddon is not happening in Iran. If it were happening, you know oil prices would already reflect it, right? And the good news here is that markets are honest. They don't read headlines, neither in Russian nor in English. They calculate risks. And as long as the oil market isn't panicking, it means that even behind the loudest rhetoric, there is still calculation, not chaos. And calculations are what ultimately form the decisions that lead to lasting peace, not to disaster or crisis. It also means that the American administration, the White House, and the military leadership for some reason believe that lower gasoline prices will last at least until the elections, if not longer. Because if they thought otherwise, there would be 10 times more bombs flying, if not 100 times more. And Trump's threat to launch 1,000 missiles at once, and then send a second 1,000, then a third, a fourth 1,000. So basically until Iran is brought to its knees, and that he wouldn't stop until then, and so on. Yes, it seems that all traders and financiers of the world markets see this as just posturing. And just blowing hot air, nothing more. And thank God for that. Because if Trump is doing this, it means he has a plan. Does he have a plan? Of course, I'm sure he does. Does Trump understand that there could be a margin of error? Of course he does. Judging by what he wrote in his books about how to bargain and negotiate, judging by his statements, he has a plan. There is more than one plan. There are fallback options and so on. Gentlemen, how can we take part in this? Don't panic. That's the most important thing. Don't panic. Take part in the elections and make sure that the Republicans remain the majority. This is the most important point. See you in the next video. Goodbye. To be continued.